Days turned into a quiet rhythm of hope inside the hospital room. Each morning, the staff expected to find her weaker, but instead, they discovered something extraordinary. She was getting stronger. At first, it was only small changes. Her voice, once faint as a whisper, carried a little more strength. Her appetite returned enough for her to take a spoonful of soup. Her eyes no longer drifted shut every few minutes, but stayed open, clear, and focused. And always by her side was Balu. He became part of her healing as naturally as breath itself. He followed her with every movement, lay across her feet to keep them warm, and rested his head on her lap when she was too tired to move. His presence seemed to wrap her in a shield, warding off the shadows of despair that had hung over her for so long. The doctors, unable to resist their curiosity, decided to run a new series of tests. They prepared the family gently, explaining that while the improvements were visible, they needed to confirm if her body was truly fighting back. For hours they worked analyzing scans, drawing blood, checking every detail. What they found left them silent. The disease that had spread like wildfire through her body showed signs of slowing. In places where they expected to see only decline, they now found small but undeniable resistance, cells repairing, strength returning where there should have been none. "It defies explanation," murmured the head physician, his voice trembling. Medically, she should not be standing. And yet, he trailed off, his eyes drifting toward the shepherd who waited patiently outside the testing room. When she returned to her bed, the girl insisted on trying to stand. She clutched the edge of the sheets, her legs shaking, but when Balu pressed himself against her side, she leaned on him, and together they managed to rise. Nurses watched with tears in their eyes as she took her first few faltering steps in weeks, one hand buried in his fur, the other holding onto his loyalty as if it were a lifeline. The corridor, once a place she had been wheeled through in silence, now echoed with the sound of her uneven footsteps and Balu's steady padding beside her. Other patients peeked from their rooms, whispering about the miracle girl and her dog, and for a moment, even those who had lost hope found themselves inspired. The doctors, who had spent their lives believing only in science, began to accept that there was something more at work here. Not a cure written in textbooks or a formula found in medicine, but something ancient and immeasurable, the power of love, loyalty, and the will to live. One of the younger doctors, her eyes wet with emotion, whispered to a colleague, "This shepherd isn't just keeping her company. He's keeping her alive." And so, each day, the girl grew a little stronger. Each night, Balu lay at her side, guarding her dreams, reminding her with every breath and every heartbeat pressed against her own that she was not alone, and that as long as he had strength, he would not allow her to surrender. The hospital, once a place filled with the quiet heaviness of grief and resignation, began to change. The story of the girl and her shepherd spread quickly through the halls, whispered from nurse to nurse, from patient to patient. Where once her room had been shadowed with despair, now it glowed with something different: hope. Nurses who used to fight back tears when they adjusted her blankets now entered with smiles, eager to see her progress. Other patients, some who had lost the will to battle their own illnesses, asked to be wheeled past her door just to glimpse the girl who was walking again with the help of her faithful dog. And every morning, without fail, Balu would nudge her awake with his cold nose, bark softly, and insist that she rise, as if declaring, another day, another step forward. Her routine grew stronger with each sunrise. First, she sat up without assistance, then stood, leaning on Balu's sturdy frame. Soon she was walking short distances, one trembling step after another, his warm body steadying her whenever she swayed. The sight of her moving through the corridor, holding onto his fur for balance, brought tears to the eyes of even the most seasoned doctors. They had treated countless patients, but never had they seen such resilience born from something so simple and yet so profound, the unconditional love of a dog. The girl's laughter, faint and fragile at first, began to ring out more often, filling the hospital wing with a sound no machine could measure. The doctors continued their tests, partly out of duty and partly because they could not comprehend what was happening. Each time, the results surprised them further. The disease that had once consumed her was slowing, retreating in ways they could not explain. This is not just medicine, one physician finally admitted during a late-night discussion with his colleagues. This is something greater. Her body is listening to her heart, and her heart listens to him. They glanced toward the corner where Balu often lay curled, sleeping lightly, always ready to wake at the smallest sound from his girl. Her family, once living in the shadow of an unbearable farewell, now found themselves daring to dream again. They sat with her, holding her hands as she shared little plans for the future, things that seemed impossible only weeks ago. "When I get better," she whispered one evening, stroking Balu's ears, "I'll take him back to the fields. We'll run again, the way we used to." Her parents could only nod, unable to speak past the lump in their throats, while the shepherd wagged his tail as though he understood every word. The girl was no longer the fading flower they had braced themselves to lose. She was blossoming again, one fragile petal at a time, her strength renewed by the constant devotion at her side. And for everyone who witnessed it, the doctors, the nurses, the other patients, it became more than just her story. It was proof that sometimes healing does not come only from medicine or machines, but from love so fierce it refuses to let go. Weeks passed, and the transformation was undeniable. The girl who had once lain pale and motionless in her hospital bed was now walking through the ward with her shepherd faithfully by her side. Her steps were still small, her body still fragile, but her eyes shone with a light that no one had seen in months. Nurses greeted her with cheers, other patients waved as she passed, and even the stern doctors could not hide their smiles. What had started as a tragedy waiting to happen had turned into a miracle unfolding before their very eyes. The day came when the doctors gathered in her room, not with sorrow in their voices, but with trembling joy. They carried the results of her latest tests, papers that told a story even they struggled to believe. Her illness, once declared unstoppable, was retreating. Where they had expected only decline, they now saw signs of healing. One doctor, usually composed and formal, removed his glasses and wiped his eyes before speaking. "You are no longer terminal," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Against every expectation, your body is winning." Her family gasped, clutching one another in disbelief, while tears ran freely down their cheeks. The girl looked at Balu, who stood proudly at her side, tail wagging as though he already knew the news. She reached down with trembling fingers to stroke his fur, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You saved me." The shepherd pressed his nose against her cheek, and the room grew silent. The girl was only 16, yet her life was slipping away far too soon. Her illness had advanced beyond the doctor's ability to heal, and their words echoed painfully in the quiet hospital room. She had only days left. Her body was fragile, her hands trembling as they rested on the blanket, her breath shallow as if each one cost her a great effort. Through the window, she could see the wide fields where she used to run and laugh, chasing butterflies and weaving flower crowns. Those days felt like another lifetime now. In those same fields, grazing quietly, was her dearest companion, a loyal shepherd dog named Balu. He had been with her since she was a small child, guarding her steps, warming her on cold nights, and standing beside her through every moment of joy and sorrow. Even now, though she was too weak to call his name, she felt his presence close by. He had refused to leave the hospital grounds, waiting by the fence, watching her window with eyes full of worry and love. The doctors visited her every day, their faces drawn with sadness. They had seen suffering before, but watching someone so young fade away carried a weight that words could never capture. Her family prayed, held her hand, and whispered reassurances they didn't quite believe themselves. But amid the quiet sorrow, something else stirred in the air, something unexplainable. For Balu, the faithful shepherd, seemed to understand what no one said aloud. He felt the urgency, the danger, and the looming shadow of loss. His sharp ears caught the sound of her weakening coughs, his heart leapt at every faint flicker of her smile, and his instinct screamed that he could not simply wait while she slipped away. Something inside him seemed to decide, If the doctors could not save her, then perhaps he could. Balu lingered by the hospital fence every day, his golden brown coat glinting under the sun, his eyes fixed on the window where his girl lay. He did not understand the words the doctors spoke, nor the way her family wept, but he felt the truth pressing into his chest. She was slipping away from him. Each night, when the corridors inside went quiet and the lights dimmed, he raised his head and let out a low, mournful howl, not wild and sharp, but soft and pleading, as if calling to her soul not to leave him. The nurses on the night shift began to notice him. Some whispered that he was just a dog waiting for scraps, but others felt something deeper in the way he sat, unmoving, his gaze steady, refusing to be distracted. They left bits of bread and meat for him at the back door, yet Balu hardly touched them. He wasn't hungry for food. He was hungry for her presence, for the sound of her voice, for the warmth of her hand resting on his head. One morning, when the doctors gathered to make their rounds, they found something unexpected. The shepherd had somehow slipped past the gate and padded quietly through the hospital halls. Nobody could explain how he had made it so far without being stopped. His paws clicked softly on the tiled floor until he reached her ward. The girl, pale and weak, lay half asleep when the door opened and he stepped inside. The moment her fading eyes caught sight of him, tears welled instantly, shining like tiny stars in the dim light. With all the strength she could summon, she lifted her trembling hand, and Balu pressed his head into it, as though he had been waiting for this moment forever. He curled up against her side on the bed, his warm body shielding her from the coldness of her illness, and he refused to move even when the nurses tried to coax him away. The doctors watched in astonishment as the monitors began to tell a different story. Her breathing steadied, her pulse grew stronger, and for the first time in weeks, the tightness in her chest seemed to ease. The girl gave a faint smile, fragile yet radiant, and whispered his name in a voice so soft it almost broke their hearts. That simple smile, that glimmer of life in her tired face, was enough to bring silence over the room. The shepherd had not brought medicine or miracles as the world understood them, yet his presence worked like something beyond science. The doctors exchanged glances, unsure whether to call it coincidence or something more, but one truth was clear. This dog was not just her companion. He was her lifeline. The following morning, when the doctors entered the ward, they expected to see the same decline they had been witnessing for weeks. The pale face, the failing heartbeat, the slow surrender of a young body too fragile to keep fighting. But what met their eyes stopped them at the doorway. The girl was not alone in her bed. Balu lay curled against her side, his head resting on her chest as if listening to her heartbeat, his fur rising and falling with every breath she took. Her hand, though thin and weak, was buried in his coat, and there was color, faint but undeniable, touching her cheeks. The doctors quickly glanced at the monitors, blinking in disbelief. Numbers that had once been alarmingly low were now shifting upwards. Her pulse was stronger, her oxygen steadier, her breathing more even. One of them leaned closer, muttering under his breath, "This is impossible. She shouldn't be stabilizing like this." The nurses gathered near the door, whispering about what they were seeing. They had watched her decline, helpless, and prepared themselves for the worst. Yet now, in the company of a dog who refused to leave her side, her body was showing signs of life no medicine had been able to spark. When the nurses had tried to remove Balu earlier, he had resisted with a strength they could not fight. He growled softly, not out of anger but out of sheer determination, pressing closer to her as if to say, "I belong here." Seeing the girl smile weakly when he was near had been enough to silence any protest. As the hours passed, the changes became even clearer. She opened her eyes more often, asked for sips of water, and whispered words no one thought she'd have the strength to say. The dog would lick away the tears that ran down her cheeks, nudging her gently whenever her eyelids grew heavy, as though reminding her to stay awake, to keep holding on. Her family, who had been preparing themselves for a final goodbye, now sat by her side with cautious hope glimmering in their eyes. They stroked Balu's head, whispering thank yous to the creature who seemed to be doing what doctors and machines could not. The medical staff, trained to rely on science, found themselves speechless. They checked her charts, repeated the tests, and compared results, but the answer was always the same. She was no longer slipping downward. Something had slowed her decline. One doctor, moved beyond words, admitted quietly to the others, "Sometimes, love does more than medicine ever can." They allowed Balu to remain, no longer as a visitor sneaking through doors, but as an official guardian of her recovery. The girl, once fading like a candle in the wind, now held on to life with a new spark in her eyes. And in the quiet moments, when no one else was watching, she whispered into Balu's fur, promising him that she would try, she would fight, not only for herself, but for the friend who had refused to let her go.